Imagine a moment when you realize you can no longer pretend. The masks you've worn for decades suddenly feel suffocating. The games everyone's playing become transparently obvious. The life you've built starts to feel like a prison made of other people's expectations. You're not depressed. You're waking up. And with that awakening comes a slow, inevitable shedding of everything that isn't truly you. Carl Jung spent his entire life documenting this process. He watched thousands of people transform spiritually and noticed something profound. Genuine spiritual growth doesn't happen through dramatic declarations or sudden changes. It happens through a gradual releasing, a slow quitting of patterns that once felt like survival, but now feel like suffocation. Today, we're exploring the 7 things Jung observed that highly spiritual people slowly, almost involuntarily quit as they awaken. These aren't conscious decisions at first. They're more like allergic reactions to inauthenticity that get stronger as your spirit gets clearer. You don't wake up one day deciding to quit these things. You wake up one day realizing you already have. If you've been feeling like you can't engage with life the way you used to, like you're becoming incompatible with normal existence, this is why your spirit is slowly rejecting everything that isn't aligned with your truth. And according to Jung, this rejection is not only inevitable, it's essential for your transformation. The first thing highly spiritual people slowly quit is the desperate hunger for approval. Not because they decide to, but because something shifts in their psychological structure that makes approval seeking physically uncomfortable. Imagine you've spent your whole life eating sugar, and suddenly your body develops an intolerance. That's what happens spiritually. The approval you once craved starts making you sick. Jung watched this in patient after patient. As they developed spiritually, they had to report strange discomfort in situations where they used to seek validation. A woman who lived for her mother's approval suddenly felt nauseous when trying to please her. A man who needed constant professional recognition found himself unable to care about promotions. Not from rebellion, from evolution. Here's what's actually happening. As you develop spiritually, you begin to access what Jung called yourself, your true authentic core that exists beyond ego. This self doesn't need approval because it's already complete. It's like a tree that's found groundwater. It no longer depends on rain. But the quitting process is slow and often painful. You'll find yourself in a meeting about to say what everyone wants to hear, and suddenly you can't. The words get stuck. Your body rebels. You might even break into a sweat. It's not anxiety. It's your authentic self refusing to participate in the performance. One of Jung's patients described it perfectly. I used to rearrange my entire personality depending on who I was with. Now, when I try, it's like my soul hits an emergency brake. I physically cannot contort myself for approval anymore. This creates a strange period where you've quit seeking approval internally, but haven't adjusted externally. You stop posting for likes, but still check your phone. You stop fishing for compliments, but still notice their absence. You're between worlds, no longer addicted to approval, but not yet comfortable without it. Jung observed that this transition typically takes years. First, you quit seeking approval from strangers, then from acquaintances, then from friends. Finally, and most difficult, from family. Each layer of release brings both freedom and grief. You're not just quitting a behavior, you're quitting an identity. The woman who lived for her mother's approval went through months of what felt like withdrawal. She had automatically reached for her phone to call her mother for validation, then remembered she couldn't do that anymore. Not because her mother wasn't available, but because her soul wouldn't let her make the call. Her hands would literally shake when she tried. But here's the beautiful part Jung documented. As the hunger for approval dies, something else is born, an unshakable sense of inner worth. Not confidence, which still references others, but worth, which references only itself. You stop needing others to validate your existence because you finally feel your existence from within. This is why highly spiritual people often seem mysteriously confident. They're not trying to be. They've simply quit the exhausting game of earning their right to exist through others' approval. They've found what Jung called inner authority, a compass that points true regardless of external opinions. The second thing, spiritual people slowly quit shocks many people: the need to be special. This is counterintuitive, because aren't spiritual people supposed to know they're unique? Yes, but there's a profound difference between knowing your uniqueness and needing to be special. Jung discovered that as people develop spiritually, they go through what seems like a paradox. They become more unique while caring less about being special. They become more themselves while needing less recognition for it. They become extraordinary by quitting the need to be seen as extraordinary. Here's what happens. Early in spiritual development, people often experience what Jung witnessed as spiritual inflation. They have a genuine awakening experience and suddenly feel chosen, special, superior. They've seen truth others haven't. They've touched dimensions others can't reach. They know things others don't. And for a while, this feeling of specialness feels like spiritual achievement. You might find yourself subtly, or not so subtly, letting others know about your meditation practice, your synchronicities, your spiritual insights. You're not exactly bragging, but you're definitely differentiating yourself from the unconscious masses. But then something shifts. Jung observed this shift in every genuinely spiritual person he studied. The need to be special starts to feel heavy, exhausting, false, like wearing a costume that once felt like wings, but now feels like chains. A man Jung treated had built his entire identity around being spiritually advanced. He was the one friends came to for wisdom, the one who always had the deepest insight, the one who meditated longer, fasted harder, knew more about consciousness than anyone else. Then one day, in the middle of explaining some profound spiritual concept, he just stopped. Mid-sentence, he later told Jung, "I suddenly saw myself from outside, and I looked ridiculous. I was using spirituality to be special, which is the opposite of spiritual." This recognition begins the slow quit. You start catching yourself about to share your spiritual experiences for the hit of specialness, about to drop hints about your consciousness level, about to position yourself as more awakened than others. And each time you catch yourself, it becomes harder to continue. The quit manifests in subtle ways. You stop mentioning your spiritual practices unless directly asked. You lose interest in comparing consciousness levels. You quit needing others to know about your insights. You become comfortable being seen as ordinary. You stop using spiritual language to elevate yourself. One woman described her transition. "I used to need everyone to know I was different, deeper, more conscious. Now I'm happy to be invisible. Being special was a prison. Being nobody is freedom." But here's what Jung found fascinating. As people quit needing to be special, they become truly unique. Not performatively unique, authentically unique. When you stop trying to stand out, your genuine nature naturally distinguishes itself. When you quit performing your specialness, your actual special qualities emerge. Jung called this individuation without inflation. You become completely yourself without needing anyone to notice. You're like a flower that blooms whether anyone's watching or not. The blooming is for the blooming, not for the watching. This shift terrifies the ego, which has often built its entire structure on being special. If I'm not special, then what am I? The ego asks. The answer, which takes years to fully accept, you're you. That's enough. That's everything. The third thing highly spiritual people quit is perhaps the most surprising: the performance of happiness. Not happiness itself, the performance of it, the constant need to appear positive, enlightened beyond suffering. Jung observed that genuine spiritual development doesn't make people perpetually happy. It makes them perpetually real. And reality includes the full spectrum of human experience: joy and sorrow, peace and turmoil, light and shadow. In our culture, there's enormous pressure to be happy, especially if you're spiritual. You're supposed to be above negative emotions, beyond petty concerns, radiating love and light at all times. But Jung discovered this performance of happiness is actually anti-spiritual. It's another mask, just with a spiritual face. As people develop genuine spiritual depth, they slowly quit this exhausting performance. They stop pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Stop forcing smiles when they're grieving. Stop spouting positive affirmations when they're genuinely struggling. They quit the spiritual bypass and embrace the spiritual embodiment. A therapist Jung supervised went through this transition dramatically. She'd built her practice on being the enlightened healer, always centered, always peaceful, always radiating wisdom. Then her son died, and she couldn't perform anymore. She tried to return to work with her spiritual persona intact, but her body wouldn't let her. She'd sit with clients trying to be the wise healer, and tears would just start falling. She told Jung, "I thought being spiritual meant transcending human pain. Now I realize it means embracing it. I can't be the enlightened one anymore. I can only be the real one." If you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, if you're feeling that slow release of things you used to grip tightly, I want you to know you're not alone. This journey of slowly quitting what no longer serves us is happening to millions of awakening souls right now. Before we explore the remaining 4 things spiritual people quit, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to join our community of souls who are courageously shedding the false to embrace the true. And please share in the comments what you've found yourself slowly quitting. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Let's continue this journey together, because the next patterns might be the very ones you're experiencing right now. The 4th thing highly spiritual people slowly quit might be the most destabilizing: the need for certainty, the desperate grip on knowing, understanding, having answers. Jung discovered that genuine spiritual growth leads not to more answers, but to being comfortable with questions. Not to more certainty, but to peace with mystery. Not to knowing, but to wonder. This terrifies the mind, which has spent a lifetime collecting certainties like armor. I know who I am. I know what's true. I know how life works. I know what happens after death. I know my purpose. These certainties feel like safety, but Jung observed they're actually prisons. As spiritual depth develops, these certainties start to crack, not because they are proven wrong, but because you realize the very need for certainty was keeping you from truth. Truth isn't something you can hold. It's something that flows. The moment you grip it, it becomes dogma. One of Jung's most brilliant patients was a physicist who came to him in crisis. His spiritual awakening had shattered his scientific certainties. He said, "I used to know how the universe worked. Now I realize I don't even know how my coffee cup works. The more conscious I become, the less certain I am about anything. This wasn't confusion. It was clarity. He was seeing past the illusion of knowledge into the reality of mystery. But the transition was agonizing. His mind desperately wanted to rebuild certainty, to find new spiritual facts to replace the old scientific ones. But every time he tried to crystallize a spiritual truth, it would dissolve. Jung watched him slowly quit the need for solid ground. First, he quit needing to know how things work. Then, he quit needing to know why things happen. Finally, he quit needing to know who he really was. He entered what Jung recognized as the cloud of unknowing, a state where not knowing becomes more truthful than any knowing could be. This quitting of certainty happens in stages. First, you quit certainty about the external world. Then, you quit certainty about others' motivations. Then, you quit certainty about your own past. Finally, you quit certainty about your own identity. Each stage of release brings both terror and liberation. The ego experiences it as death, which it is. The death of the know-it-all mind that kept you safe but small. A woman described her process. I used to have strong opinions about everything: politics, spirituality, relationships, purpose. Now, when someone asks what I believe, I honestly don't know. Not from confusion, but from openness. Every certainty I release creates space for something more beautiful than answers, presence with what is. Jung found that people who successfully quit certainty develop something remarkable: the ability to hold paradox. They can believe contradictory things simultaneously without needing resolution. They can act decisively without being certain. They can commit fully while staying open to being completely wrong. This isn't wishy-washy relativism. It's what Jung witnessed as spiritual maturity, the recognition that reality is bigger than any mental model can contain. You quit certainty not because nothing is true, but because truth is too alive to be caged in concepts. The fifth thing highly spiritual people slowly quit is one of the hardest: blame. Not just blaming others, but the entire victim-perpetrator narrative that the ego uses to make sense of suffering. Jung observed that as people develop spiritually, they undergo a radical shift in how they relate to their wounds. They stop seeing themselves as victims of others' actions and start seeing themselves as participants in a larger pattern. This isn't about excusing harm or bypassing trauma. It's about reclaiming power. The quitting of blame is slow and often painful because blame serves so many psychological functions. It explains our pain. It preserves our innocence. It gives us an identity. It bonds us with others who've been similarly wronged. Letting go of blame can feel like letting go of our entire story. A woman came to Jung filled with legitimate grievances: abusive childhood, betraying ex-husband, discriminating employers. Her anger was justified, her blame accurate, but it was also killing her. She was so identified with being wronged that she couldn't move forward. Through years of work, Jung watched her slowly quit blame, not by denying what happened or forgiving prematurely, but by recognizing her own participation in patterns. She saw how she unconsciously chose partners who would betray her, jobs that would discriminate, situations that would confirm her victim identity. She told Jung, "The day I stopped blaming was the day I became free, not because others weren't wrong, they were, but because I finally saw that holding on to blame was my choice. I was using their wrongness to avoid my own responsibility for my life." This shift is excruciating for the ego. It means taking responsibility for things that genuinely weren't your fault. It means seeing how you unconsciously participated in your own wounding. It means admitting that on some level, you needed the very experiences you've spent years blaming others for. Jung documented the stages of quitting blame. 1. Rage at the unfairness. This shouldn't have happened. 2. Recognition of patterns. This keeps happening. 3. Seeing unconscious participation. I somehow contribute to this. 4. Taking radical responsibility. I am the author of my experience. 5. Transcending the victim-perpetrator paradigm. We are all playing roles in each other's awakening. A man who'd spent decades blaming his father for his struggles went through this process. He said, I realized I'd made my father into a monster to avoid seeing my own shadows. The day I quit blaming him, I saw him clearly for the first time. Just another wounded human doing his best with his own trauma. And I saw myself clearly too, not a victim, but a soul who chose this exact father for my own evolution. This doesn't mean accepting abuse or staying in harmful situations. It means recognizing that even our wounds serve our awakening. Jung observed that the people who quit blame don't become doormats. They become powerful. They stop giving others the power to define their story. The sixth thing spiritual people quit is particularly subtle: spiritual bypassing. Using spiritual concepts to avoid genuine human experience, spiritual practices to escape difficult emotions, enlightenment as a strategy to bypass being human. Jung saw this constantly in spiritual communities. People using meditation to avoid feeling, using everything happens for a reason to avoid grief, using we're all one to avoid boundaries, using ego death to avoid psychological work. The spiritual path becoming another elaborate defense mechanism. As genuine spiritual maturity develops, this bypassing becomes impossible. Your soul demands full embodiment, spiritual and human, transcendent and immanent, infinite and intimate. You can no longer use heaven to escape earth. A Buddhist practitioner came to Jung after 20 years of meditation. He'd achieved remarkable states of consciousness, experienced profound emptiness, touched the void, but his relationships were disasters. His emotions were numbed. His life was dissociated. He'd used enlightenment to bypass his humanity. Jung watched him slowly quit this bypass. It was more painful than his original awakening. He had to come back down into his body, into his feelings, into his very human needs and desires. After touching the infinite, he had to learn to be finite again. After experiencing no self, he had to rebuild a healthy self. He described it. I thought spirituality was about transcending human experience. Now I realize it's about finally having human experience. I spent 20 years trying to be nobody. Now I'm learning to be somebody. This particular somebody, with this particular life, these particular wounds and gifts. The quitting of spiritual bypassing looks like admitting you have preferences despite accepting what is. Feeling anger despite understanding everyone's doing their best. Wanting intimacy despite knowing we're already one. Having boundaries despite seeing all as self. Experiencing fear despite trusting the universe. This creates what Jung observed as spiritual maturity, the ability to be fully human and fully spiritual simultaneously, not using one to escape the other, but living at the intersection where heaven meets earth. The final thing highly spiritual people quit might surprise you: the isolation of awakening, the belief that spiritual growth means growing apart from others, that consciousness creates loneliness, that awakening means being alone. Jung observed that while spiritual growth often requires periods of solitude, genuine spiritual maturity leads back to connection, but connection of a completely different quality. Not the unconscious merging of the asleep, but the conscious meeting of the awake. Early in awakening, isolation feels necessary and even noble. You're seeing through illusions others still believe. You're feeling things others can't feel. You're knowing things others don't know. How can you possibly connect with people who are asleep? But Jung watched this spiritual superiority slowly dissolve in those who continued growing. They quit the subtle arrogance of being more conscious. They quit the identity of being the awakened one among the sleeping. They quit the isolation that was actually protecting them from intimacy. A woman who'd spent years in spiritual solitude told Jung, "I thought I was alone because I was too conscious for others. Then I realized I was alone because I was afraid of being seen in my humanity, my struggles, my very non-enlightened moments. My spiritual isolation was actually spiritual pride." As she quit this isolation, something beautiful happened. She found she could connect with anyone, not by lowering her consciousness, but by embracing her humanity. She could be with unconscious people without judgment because she recognized her own unconscious patterns. She could love asleep people because she remembered her own sleep. Jung documented that genuine spiritual maturity leads to what he called conscious relationship, the ability to connect without merging, love without attachment, be intimate without losing self, share truth without preaching, be together in aloneness. The quitting of isolation doesn't mean returning to unconscious social patterns. It means finding those rare others who are also quitting. Quitting approval, seeking, quitting specialness, quitting performance, quitting certainty, quitting blame, quitting bypassing. And with these people creating something new, conscious community. As we reach the end of this journey through what highly spiritual people quit, Jung would want you to understand something crucial. This quitting isn't loss, it's liberation. Each thing you release creates space for something more authentic to emerge. When you quit seeking approval, inner worth emerges. When you quit being special, true uniqueness emerges. When you quit performing happiness, genuine joy emerges. When you quit needing certainty, wisdom emerges. When you quit blame, power emerges. When you quit bypassing, embodiment emerges. When you quit isolation, real connection emerges. The process is slow because it's not just behavioral change, it's identity death and rebirth. You're not just quitting habits, you're quitting who you thought you were. And that takes time, courage, and enormous compassion for yourself. Jung observed that this process typically takes years, even decades. You'll quit and return, release and grip again, let go and grab back. This isn't failure, it's the spiral nature of growth. Each time you return to an old pattern, you're a little less attached. Each time you grip again, your grip is a little looser. If you're in this process of slowly quitting, Jung would want you to know you're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself. Every release is a revelation. Every letting go is a coming home. The things you're quitting needed to be experienced fully before they could be released. You needed to seek approval to know the emptiness of external validation. You needed to be special to discover the freedom of being ordinary. You needed certainty to appreciate mystery. You needed to blame to find your power. This isn't a process you can rush or force. The quitting happens in its own time, in its own way. Your job isn't to quit faster, but to be present with the quitting, to notice what's falling away, to grieve what's dying, to celebrate what's being born. And remember, you're not alone in this. All over the world, souls are waking up and slowly quitting the same things. We're all discovering that spiritual growth isn't about adding more. It's about releasing what was never true. Not about becoming someone new, but about quitting being someone we're not. If this journey resonates with you, if you're recognizing your own slow quitting in these patterns, subscribe to this channel and become part of our growing community of awakening souls. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our daily deep dives into the spiritual journey.